The high plains wind had a sound all its own. It was not a whistle, but a low moan that promised winter long before the first snows fell. Jack Donovan knew that sound better than any human voice. He had lived with it, just the wind and the creaking of his ranch house, for 8 long years. 8 years since Mary was buried on the low hill overlooking the creek, taking their infant son with her. The land around him was vast, stretching out in every direction under a sky so big it threatened to swallow a man whole. This was the Wyoming Territory, in the high country where the plains finally gave up and crumpled into the mountains. The year was 1884, the Donovan Ranch. The Tilted J was 2 days' ride from the nearest real town, and a half-day ride from the cluster of buildings they called Junction. It was hard country. The soil was stingy, the cattle were mean, and the weather was always trying to kill you. Jack's spread was large, mostly grazing land, dry and brittle yellow grass that his longhorns seemed to thrive on. Jack was a man carved from the same material as the land. He was middle-aged, 44 years old, though the sun and the grief had etched deeper lines into his face than the years alone could account for. His hands were thick, scarred from rope burns and barbed wire and the cold. He was solitary, but he was not weak. A man could not be weak and survive out here. Yet, the loneliness was a different kind of predator. It did not attack fast, like a mountain lion. It was slow, like the rust that ate his tools. It settled onto him, heaviest in the quiet hours before dawn. He rose every morning in the dark. The floorboards of the ranch house were cold beneath his feet. He would light the stove, his motions economical, practiced. The house was sturdy, built of cottonwood logs he had hauled himself, but it was hollow. It was a shelter, not a home. The small rocking chair Mary had loved still sat by the hearth, covered in a calico quilt she had pieced together. He never sat in it. He just kept it clean. His failure, as he saw it, was the coffee. He could not make decent coffee. It came out tasting like boiled dirt every single time. He would drink the scalding liquid anyway. Standing by the window, watching the first gray light touch the peaks of the mountains to the west. He ran the Tilted J with only 2 hands. One was a young drifter named Billy, quiet and quick with the horses. The other was an old-timer, Gus, a man with a beard stained by tobacco and a loyalty that was absolute. Gus had known Mary. Gus never spoke of her, and Jack was grateful for it. The 3 of them ate what they could scrounge or shoot, or what Jack managed to cook. Their meals were functional: salt pork, beans, sourdough biscuits that were often hard as stones. It was food for fuel. Nothing more. Jack was tired of it. He was tired of the silence, tired of the taste of ash in his own cooking. He missed the smell of baking bread. He missed the scent of a stew simmering, the kind of simple, warm meal that made a man feel human after a day of fighting the land. He was not looking for love. He had tried that once, and the hole it left was too deep to risk again. He was a practical man. He was the owner of a ranch that was barely turning a profit. What he needed, he told himself, was a helper, someone to manage the house, to cook the meals, to bring some small measure of order and comfort to the place. He needed a cook, a good cook. The decision formed slowly over many weeks. But one morning, after choking down another mouthful of bitter coffee and burnt bacon, the decision settled hard. He would ride into Junction. He would post a notice at the general store. Perhaps he would even ask Silas, the owner of the Silver Dollar Saloon, if he knew of any women passing through who needed honest work. He saddled his horse, a tough bay gelding, and told Gus he would be gone for the day. The ride to Junction was long, the sun beating down even in the autumn. The land was dry, the creek beds cracked. He passed no one on the trail. Junction was not much of a town. It was 3 dusty streets, a collection of false-fronted wooden buildings that looked temporary, like they might blow away in a strong wind. There was the general store, a blacksmith, a livery, the land office, and the Silver Dollar Saloon. It was a place where things moved slowly, but tension always simmered just beneath the surface. Cattle disputes, arguments over water rights, or just the raw friction of hard men living too close together. It could all ignite in a second. Jack tied his horse to the hitching rail outside the general store. He nodded to Mr. Abernathy, the proprietor, a small man who wore a green visor indoors and out. Jack bought coffee, flour, and beans, loading them into his saddlebags. He stood for a moment, looking at the community board. There was a notice for a lost mule and a poster for a county fair 200 miles away. He hesitated. Writing a notice for a housekeeper felt too personal. It felt like admitting defeat. He pushed the thought away. He was a rancher. This was a practical problem. He would handle it. First, however, he needed something to cut the dust. He walked across the street, his boots sinking into the thick dust that carpeted the road. The Silver Dollar was quiet for midday. The bat-wing doors swung shut behind him, cutting off the bright glare. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale beer, cheap whiskey, and sawdust. A man in the corner played a tinny piano, missing half the notes. A few ranchers nursed warm beers at the tables. Jack walked to the bar. Silas, the owner, was wiping down the warped wood surface with a gray rag. Silas was a heavy man, with a vest that strained across his middle and a mustache that he waxed. "One whiskey, Silas," Jack said. Silas poured the drink. He pushed the glass toward Jack. "Long ride, Donovan." "Long enough." Jack sipped the whiskey. It burned, but it was a familiar burn. Silas leaned closer, his voice low, looking for hands. Jack shook his head. "Not for the herd." He paused, feeling the weight of the admission. "I am looking for a cook, someone to manage the house." Silas grunted, picking up another glass to wipe. "That is a rare commodity out here. The decent ones are married. The others, well..." He gestured with his chin toward the back of the room. Jack turned his head. He had not noticed her when he came in. She was in the far corner, scrubbing a table with a bucket of gray water. She was young, perhaps 20 years old. She was Native American. That was plain to see. Her black hair was pulled back in a simple braid, but strands had escaped, framing a face that was sharp and angular. She wore a simple dress of rough brown cloth, not the bright colors of the other women who worked for Silas. She was not scrubbing the table so much as attacking it. Her motions were angry, jerky. 2 cattle hands at the next table over were watching her, laughing. One of them, a lout with a red beard, reached out and grabbed her arm as she passed. "Hey there, wildcat," the man slurred. "You missed a spot." The girl stopped. She did not pull away. She slowly turned her head and looked at the man. Her eyes, Jack saw even from across the room, were black and deep, and they held no fear at all. They held pure, cold fire. "Take your hand off me," she said. Her voice was low, but it cut through the bad piano music. The man laughed. "Or what, you will scalp me." His friend chuckled. The man tightened his grip on her arm. She moved faster than Jack thought possible. She did not scream or faint. She dropped the rag, and with her free hand, she grabbed the half-full beer bottle from the man his table. She smashed it against the table edge, leaving her holding the jagged glass neck. She raised it, aiming for the man his face. The man yelled, falling backward out of his chair. He let go of her arm to scramble away, his face pale. Silas roared from behind the bar. "Sarah, enough." The girl, Sarah, stood frozen for a second, the broken bottle held like a knife. Her chest was heaving. She looked, Jack thought, like a wolf cornered, desperate, beautiful, and absolutely lethal. She was not a domestic creature. The men in the saloon gave her a wide berth. She was, as the Society of Junction would see it, completely untamable. Silas hurried over, snatching the bottle from her hand. "You break one more thing, girl. You will be working here until you are gray. You hear me." The girl said nothing. She just stared at the spot where the man had been. Her past was a shadow that hung around her, a visible thing, a cloak of trauma and pain that she wore as armor. She wanted to be free. Jack could see that clear as day, but the world had other plans for her. Jack finished his whiskey. He pushed the glass forward. "That her name's Sarah?" he asked quietly. Silas scowled. Walking back to the bar, "Sarah Redfeather, and she is more trouble than a whole tribe. Got her from the sheriff up north. She was jailed for assault, stabbed a man who tried to bother her. I paid her fine. Thought she could work it off here, but she is wild. Good for nothing but breaking glass and scaring customers." Jack watched the girl. She had returned to the bucket, her back stiff, her hands trembling slightly as she picked up the rag. She was alone, utterly alone. He knew what that felt like. He looked at Silas. "How much does she owe?" "Silas," his eyes narrowed. "You thinking of hiring her, Donovan?" "She is not a cook. She is a savage." "How much, Silas?" Silas did the math in his head, his lips moving. $50 for the fine and the damages she has caused since. That was a steep price. That was 2 prime steers. Jack looked at the girl again. She was strong. She was a survivor. He was tired of biscuits that tasted like rocks. He was tired of the silence in his house. He was not looking for love. He was looking for a cook. But seeing her stand up to that man, he felt something else. Respect. "I will pay it," Jack said. "Silas." His eyebrows shot up. "Just like that." Just like that. Jack pulled his leather purse from his coat. He counted out the coins onto the bar. The sound of the metal on the wood was loud in the quiet room. Silas scooped up the money quickly, as if afraid Jack would change his mind. "She is all yours, then. Good luck. You will need it." Jack walked across the room. The few men watched him, curious. The girl, Sarah, heard him approach and straightened up. She turned, facing him, the dirty rag in her hand. She watched him with those same eyes, suspicious and proud. She expected him to be like the others. Jack stopped a few feet from her. He was a tall man, and he knew he cast a long shadow. He kept his hands loose at his sides. "My name is Jack Donovan," he said, his voice even. "I own the Tilted J Ranch. I just paid your debt to Mr. Silas." She did not relax. She did not thank him. She just watched. "What does that mean?" she asked. "It means you do not work for him anymore. You work for me." Her eyes hardened. "I am no man his slave." Jack nodded slowly. "I am not looking for a slave. I am looking for a cook. The work is hard. The ranch is quiet, but it is honest work. You will have your own room. You will be safe." She searched his face, looking for the lie, looking for the trap. She had a history full of traps. "Why me?" she asked. "Because you look like you would rather fight than cry, and I am tired of my own cooking." He offered no smile, just the simple, sincere truth. She looked down at the bucket of filthy water, then back at him. She weighed her options, a saloon or a ranch, a man who let others grab her, or a man who stood tall and spoke plain. "I can cook," she said finally. "I can keep men from starving." Jack nodded. "That will do. Get your things." She looked down at the dress she was wearing. "I have no things," she said. Jack looked at her for a long moment. The waste of it. The hardness of the world that would strip a person down to nothing but their own anger. "Then come as you are," Jack Donovan said. He turned and walked toward the door, not looking back to see if she was following. He knew she would be. The silver dollar was a cage, and he was offering her a different one. Maybe, just maybe, it was one with an open door. He pushed through the batwing doors, back into the harsh, bright sunlight. A moment later, he heard her footsteps behind him, light on the boardwalk. The town watched them, the silent rancher and the wild Indian girl. Jack untied his horse, and for the first time in 8 years, he was not riding home alone. He was not sure if he had just solved his problem or started a much bigger one. Jack stopped at his horse first, checking the cinch on his saddle. He did not offer her a ride on his horse. The ranch was a long way, but he had the wagon, which he had left at the livery while he saw to his business. He had provisions to take back. He gestured with his head. "Come on." He led the way, his steps long and measured, not slowing for her. She followed, a few paces behind him. She was a ghost at his back, making almost no sound on the dusty street. The sun was hot, beating down from a pale, empty sky. The few people in Junction paused to watch them pass. The blacksmith, his face slick with sweat, stopped hammering. Mrs. Abernathy, who had been sweeping the boardwalk, froze, her broom held in midair. Their faces were plain curiosity, disapproval, a little bit of pity, though for which of them, Jack could not be sure. Jack ignored them. He was used to being stared at, though usually for different reasons. He was a solitary man, a widower. He kept to himself. This, bringing a young, wild-looking native girl out of a saloon, was an act that would be discussed for weeks. Sarah felt their eyes on her like physical blows. She kept her chin up, her gaze fixed on the broad, steady line of Jack Donovan, his back. She had been stared at her whole life. As a girl, she was stared at for being who she was. After her family was gone, she was stared at for being a survivor, a stray. In the saloon, she was stared at like a piece of meat on a hook. This was different. She was walking behind a man who had paid $50 for her. Not for her body, he had said, but for her cooking. She did not know if she believed him. Men lied. They lied about everything. They lied with their mouths and with their eyes and with their hands. This man, Jack Donovan, he was quiet. His eyes were gray, like the sky before a snow. And they held a deep sadness, but also a hardness. He had not looked at her the way the other men did. He had looked at her like he was measuring a horse, checking its teeth, its legs, its spirit. It was insulting, but it was also, strangely, honest. Jack stopped at the general store. He tied his horse again. He turned to her. "You will need things," he stated. It was not a question. She said nothing, just looked at the dress she wore. It was thin, torn at the hem, stained with beer and lye. He went inside. She hesitated at the door, a sudden, sharp fear catching in her throat. The dark interior of the store felt like another kind of trap. He paused in the doorway and looked back at her. "You comin'?" She took a breath and stepped over the threshold. The store smelled of coffee beans, new denim, cured tobacco, and cheese. It was overwhelming. Mr. Abernathy, the proprietor, was behind the counter. His green visor pulled low. His eyes flickered to Sarah, and his mouth tightened into a thin, disapproving line. "Afternoon again. Mr. Donovan," he said. His voice clipped. "Forgot something." Jack ignored the man, his tone. He walked to the racks of clothing. He pulled out a pair of his denim trousers, the smallest pair they had. He held them up, measuring them against his own frame, then looked at her. He seemed to be calculating her size. He added 2 simple flannel shirts, thick wool socks, and a pair of sturdy work boots. He put the pile on the counter. Then he walked to the other side of the store, where the women his goods were kept. He paused, looking lost. He picked up a bolt of dark blue calico, felt the material between his rough thumb and forefinger, and set it down. He looked back at Sarah, a flicker of something, embarrassment, passing over his features. "You will need a dress," he said, "for town, and whatever else a woman needs." Sarah felt a flush of heat rise in her neck. He was buying her. Now he was dressing her. She stepped forward. She would not be a doll. She pointed to a bolt of the plainest, toughest brown duck cloth, the same material used for wagon covers. "That one," she said. Her voice was rusty, but clear, and thread. "Mr. Abernathy looked from her to Jack. Jack gave a short nod. He picked out the material himself. "Abernathy," Jack said, his voice flat, "and a set of needles. And soap." He added a sheathed knife to the pile, a simple, wooden-handled skinning knife. He did not look at her when he did it. He just added it to her things. Mr. Abernathy. His eyes went wide when he saw the blade. But he said nothing, just rang up the sale. Jack paid in coin. He gathered the supplies, handing the bundle of clothing and the knife to Sarah. She took it, the weight solid in her arms. The knife was a promise, or perhaps it was a warning. She did not know which. She slipped it into the bundle, her fingers closing around the handle for just a second. They went to the livery, where Jack his wagon was stored. It was a solid buckboard, loaded with the sacks of flour and beans he had bought earlier. He threw a tarp over them. "Put your things in the back," he said. He hitched his bay gelding to the wagon, his movements economical and sure. He did not ask her if she could ride. He did not have a spare horse, and he clearly did not intend for her to ride his. She was cargo, same as the flour. She climbed into the wagon bed and sat on a sack of beans, her bundle beside her. She would not sit on the bench next to him. She would not sit beside any man. Jack climbed up to the driver's seat, took the reins, and with a soft click of his tongue, set the wagon in motion. They rolled out of Junction, past the last few buildings, and onto the open plain. The ride was long. The sun crawled across the massive sky, burning from white-hot at noon to a deep, bruised orange as the afternoon wore on. The wagon wheels creaked, a rhythmic, grinding sound that matched the low moan of the wind. They did not talk. Jack kept his eyes on the trail, which was really just two faint ruts in the dry grass. He was deeply aware of her sitting behind him. He could not see her, but he could feel her presence. It was like carrying a lit stick of dynamite in the back of his wagon. She was all sharp edges and coiled tension. He had wanted a cook. He had wanted peace. He had a feeling he had just brought home a war. He thought about the $50. It was a foolish purchase. He could have hired a widow from back east for that price, paid her passage, someone quiet and grateful. Instead, he had this, a girl with eyes like hot coals, who broke bottles and carried a knife. He cursed himself silently. He was not a young man, prone to grand gestures. He was a practical man. So what, then, was this? He glanced back, just once. She was not looking at him. She was looking out at the land. Her face was calm, her expression unreadable. She was watching the roll of the hills, the way the light hit the mountains, the hawks circling high overhead. She was not looking at it like a prisoner. She was looking at it like she knew it, like she was reading it. The land was harsh, unforking, but it was honest. It did not lie, the way people did. Jack understood that. He had a feeling she did too. He felt an unexpected, unwelcome pang. Not of attraction, not the way the men in the saloon would feel. It was something deeper, something that pulled at the knot of his own loneliness. It was kinship. He recognized the look. It was the look of someone who had lost everything and was still standing. He turned back around, his hands tightening on the reins. He could not afford feelings like that. Feelings were what got Mary killed. Feelings were a luxury this land did not permit. For Sarah, the silence was a relief. After the noise of the saloon, the men his laughter, the bad piano, the constant scraping demands, this quiet was a balm. The wind felt good on her face. The land was open. She hated towns. Towns were traps. They were full of walls and small, mean people. The land, this high, empty country, was different. It was dangerous, yes, but its dangers were clean. A rattlesnake warned you. A blizzard showed its hand. Men smiled while they sharpened their knives. This Jack Donovan, he was a puzzle. He had paid for her. He had bought her clothes and a knife. He had not tried to touch her. He had not spoken more than 20 words to her. He just drove the wagon, his back a solid wall between them. She watched the sun set, the sky turning a violent, beautiful shade of purple and red. The air grew cold immediately. A shiver ran through her, one she could not suppress. Jack heard the faint rattle of her teeth without turning. He reached behind him and grabbed a thick wool blanket from his bedroll. He tossed it back over his shoulder. "Cover yourself," he said. "The nights get cold fast." She caught the blanket. It was heavy, smelling faintly of horse, leather, and the clean, cold scent of the man himself. She wrapped it around her shoulders. It was warm. It was the first simple, uncomplicated kindness she had known in a very long time. She hated him for it. Kindness was a trick. It was a way to make you lower your guard. She would not lower hers. She would stay awake. She would keep the knife ready. It was full dark when they finally crested a long ridge. Below them, in a shallow valley, she saw a few pinpricks of light, a house and a smaller building, a bunkhouse. They were tiny, islands in a vast black ocean of land. The loneliness of the place was staggering. It was more isolated than any place she had ever been. Jack pulled the wagon up to the main house. It was a low, solid log building. A yellow light glowed in one window. The door opened, spilling light onto the hard-packed dirt. An old man stood silhouetted in the doorway, a rifle held loosely in his hands. "That you, boss?" he called out, his voice a gravelly rasp. "It is me, Gus," Jack called back. He set the brake and climbed down. His body was stiff from the long ride. He walked around to the back of the wagon. Gus limped out, his eyes squinting in the dark. He saw Sarah, still sitting in the wagon bed, wrapped in the blanket. His jaw dropped. The rifle came up a few inches. "Well now," he said, his voice dropping. "Who is this?" "This is Sarah," Jack said, his voice tired. "She is the new cook." Gus looked from Jack to Sarah and back again. He looked at her dark hair, her high cheekbones, her proud, defiant stare. He looked at the rough saloon dress she still wore. "A cook," he repeated, disbelief thick in his voice. Jack did not explain. He did not justify. He just nodded. "She will be staying in the house." Another figure emerged from the bunkhouse, drawn by the voices. This one was younger, barely a man. He moved with a quick, restless energy. This was Billy. He, too, stared, his mouth open. "Help me unhitch," Jack said to Billy, his tone leaving no room for questions. "Gus, get some lamps lit in the house." Jack turned to Sarah. He offered a hand to help her down. She ignored it. She unwrapped the blanket, set it aside, and climbed over the side of the wagon, landing lightly on her feet. She held her bundle of new clothes in her arms. Jack dropped his hand, not offended, just accepting. He had expected as much. "Come inside," he said. "I will show you your room." He led the way. She followed. Gus held the door open for them, his face a mask of confusion. The main room was large, dominated by a massive stone fireplace. It was a man's room. It was clean, but sparse. A few simple wooden chairs, a long dining table, shelves holding tins and jars. A rifle rack by the door held 2 gleaming Winchesters. The air smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and coffee. Jack lit a lantern on the main table. The warm light pushed back the shadows. "This is the main room," he said. "The kitchen is through there." He pointed. "My room is at the end of the hall. Gus and Billy sleep in the bunkhouse." He led her down a short, dark hallway. He opened a door. The room inside was small, barely big enough for the narrow cot against the wall. There was a small, scarred dresser and a single window. A rocking chair sat in the corner, covered by a colorful quilt. It was Mary, his sewing room. "This will be yours," he said. "The door has a lock." He set a small key on the dresser. Sarah looked at the key. A lock, a door she could close. She looked at him. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the small rocking chair, his face unreadable in the lantern light. "The kitchen," he said, his voice suddenly rough. "I will show you in the morning. We ate on the trail. You can rest." He turned and left, pulling the door closed behind him. She heard his boots walk down the hall. She heard the front door of the ranch house open and close. She was alone. She walked to the door and touched the simple iron lock. She turned the key. It clicked shut. She let out a breath she did not know she had been holding. She sank down onto the cot, her bundle clutched to her chest. She was not free. She had been bought and sold, moved from one cage to another. But this cage was different. It was quiet. It was empty. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, she had a key. She pulled the skinning knife from the bundle and laid it on the cot beside her, its wooden handle smooth and solid under her trembling hand. The sun came up hard and fast, a clean white line that slit open the darkness. Jack was up before it, moving in the cold shadows of the ranch house. He pulled on his boots, the leather stiff and cold. He glanced down the hall. The door to her room was still closed, locked, he presumed. He felt a ridiculous knot of apprehension. He had slept poorly, listening for a sound, a footstep, a creak. He had heard nothing. She was as silent as the dust mice. He went into the kitchen and began his morning ritual. He stirred the embers in the stove, added fresh kindling, and got a small fire going. He scooped coffee grounds into the pot, grounds he had paid good money for, and added water from the bucket. He set it on the stove to boil. He was a man of routine. Routine was the fence that kept the chaos out. He had bought this girl, this woman, and brought her straight into the heart of his quiet life. He decided, a fool. He was hacking off a piece of salt pork when he heard the click of the lock. He did not turn. He kept his back to the hallway, listening. He heard the door swing open. He heard soft footsteps. He braced himself. She appeared in the kitchen doorway. He finally turned to look at her. She was not wearing the saloon dress. She was wearing the denim trousers and one of the flannel shirts he had bought. The trousers were cinched tight at her waist with a short piece of rope she must have found. The shirt sleeves were rolled up past her elbows, revealing strong, brown forearms. Her black hair was pulled back in a single, severe braid. She looked capable. She also looked like she had not slept at all. Her eyes were dark, watchful, and filled with a banked, suspicious fire. "I am not your slave," she said. Her voice was low, rough from disuse, but it did not tremble. It was a statement of fact, absolute and unyielding. Jack paused, the knife in his hand. The coffee on the stove began to bubble, a sulphurous, muddy smell filling the room. He was, for a moment, completely baffled. He was a rancher. He dealt in cattle, fences, and weather. He did not know how to handle this. "I never said you were," he replied, his voice flat. "You paid money." "I paid your fine. I need a cook." She looked around the kitchen. Her gaze was sharp, critical. She looked at the filthy pot of coffee, the chunk of salt pork in his hand, the sack of flour on the floor that had a small hole nibbled in the corner. Her lip curled, just slightly. It was a look of pure disdain. "This is not a kitchen," she said. "It is a pig trough." Jack felt a flush of anger. He had not been insulted in his own home in 8 years. He was about to say something sharp, but the front door opened, and Gus and Billy came in, stamping the cold from their feet. They stopped dead when they saw Sarah. They saw her in the men his clothes, her braid hanging down her back, her face hard as granite. They saw Jack, frozen by the counter. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Gus recovered first, slowly taking off his hat. "Morning, boss." Billy just stared, his young face a mask of confusion. Sarah ignored them all. She walked past Jack, took the knife from his unresisting hand, and looked at the blade. She ran her thumb lightly over the edge. It was sharp. He had bought her a good knife. She seemed to file this one fact away. She turned to the stove, grabbed a rag, and lifted the boiling coffee pot. She walked to the back door, opened it, and threw the entire contents out onto the dirt. Jack just watched. That was a 1/4 pound of coffee. She came back in, her movements precise and angry. Where is the lie?" she demanded. Jack, still baffled, pointed to a tin under the sink. She spent the next hour not cooking, but cleaning. She scrubbed the stovetop until the iron gleamed. She scrubbed the counters. She scalded the coffee pot. She found the weevil-infested flour sack, took it outside, and emptied it for the chickens. She found the good sacks, the ones he had just bought, and consolidated them. She moved with a furious, focused energy. Jack, Gus, and Billy stood in the main room, watching her, completely bewildered. They felt like intruders. Finally, she stopped. The kitchen was clean. She turned, faced the men. "You will have breakfast," she said. It was not a question. It was a challenge. She proceeded to cook. She did not ask where things were. She just found them. Her hands moved with a speed and confidence that was mesmerizing. She mixed biscuit dough, her fingers working fast and light. She sliced the salt pork thin, just right, and had it sizzling in a pan. She found the cache of eggs Billy kept from the handful of neglected hens that roamed the yard. She started a new pot of coffee. The smell that filled the house was not the smell Jack was used to. It was not the scent of survival. It was the scent of food. Real food. The rich aroma of good coffee. The smell of baking bread. The sharp, savory smell of frying meat. She did not speak again. She put 3 plates on the main table. She filled them. Biscuits, light and golden, eggs fried perfectly, slices of pork, crisp and not burnt. She poured 3 cups of coffee, black and strong. Then she retreated to the kitchen. She did not sit with them. She leaned against the counter, her arms crossed, watching them eat. Gus picked up a biscuit. He looked at it, suspicious. He took a bite. His eyes widened. He looked at Jack, his jaw working. He took another bite, faster this time. Billy ate like a starving wolf, not even seeming to breathe. Jack drank the coffee. It was strong. It was clear. It tasted like heaven. He took a bite of the biscuit. It melted in his mouth. He ate the entire meal in a silence that was heavier than any he had ever known in this house. It was the best breakfast he had had in 8 years. When they were finished, she picked up the plates, took them to the kitchen, and began to wash. Jack put on his hat. He felt unsteady. He had wanted a cook. He had gotten a whirlwind. He looked at Gus and Billy. We have fences to check," he said, and the 3 men fled the house, escaping into the cold, familiar air of the morning. Jack expected her to stay in the house. That was the job. Cook, clean. He was wrong. He was in the corral, checking the hoof on his bay gelding. When he saw her, she had finished in the kitchen. Now she was outside, wearing one of his old, cast-off coats that she must have taken from a peg by the door. It was miles too big for her, but it broke the wind. She was standing by the chicken coop. It was a flimsy thing, half collapsed. The hens pecked listlessly in the dirt. She studied it for a long minute. Then she went to the woodpile. She found an axe. She began splitting timber. Gus, who was mending a bridle, stopped. "Boss," he said, his voice low. "Look at that." Jack looked. She was handling the axe as well as he could. She was strong, her movements economical, balanced. She was not just a cook. She knew work. She spent the rest of the morning reinforcing the chicken coop, using nails she had found in the shed. She found the weed-choked patch of ground that had once been Mary, his vegetable garden. She stood over it, her hands on her hips, assessing it. Jack watched her from a distance. He saw her pull the knife from the sheath at her belt, the knife he had bought her. She knelt in the dirt and began, with a precise, violent efficiency, to weed. Later that afternoon, the real surprise came. They were moving a small cluster of cows closer to the creek, when a new calf, spooked by a rabbit, bolted and got itself tangled in a patch of wild brush and loose wire near the bank. The mother cow, a mean-eyed longhorn, bellowed, stamping her feet. ready to charge anything that came near. Billy sighed, pulling his rope. This is going to be trouble. He is going to have to rope the mother just to get to the calf. Before Jack could even form a plan, Sarah was there. She seemed to come from the earth itself, walking up from the creek bed. You will make her fight, she said, her voice sharp. You stay back. Billy looked at Jack, confused. Jack just raised a hand. Wait. Sarah did not approach the cow. She circled, wide, moving low and smooth. She never took her eyes off the mother. She began to speak. It was not English. It was a low, rhythmic sound. A song, almost, a croon. It was a sound that belonged to the wind in the grass. The mother cow stopped stamping. She turned her head, listening. Her ears flicked. She was still nervous, but the killing rage was gone, replaced by confusion. Sarah kept talking, moving, never directly at the calf, but closer, closer. She reached the brush. She pulled her knife. She did not hack. She cut, precise and quick, freeing the entangled legs. The calf, bawling, struggled to its feet. She gave the calf a firm slap on the rump, sending it scrambling toward the mother. The mother mooed, a low, worried sound, and turned to nose her baby. Sarah was already walking away, disappearing back down into the creek bed, the knife already back in its sheath. Billy just sat on his horse, his rope still coiled. Gus spat a stream of tobacco onto the ground. Well, he said, to no one in particular, I will be damned. Jack said nothing. He watched the creek bed where she had vanished. He had hired her to cook biscuits. He had thought her wild, untamable. He was beginning to realize he had misunderstood the word completely. She was not wild in the way of chaos. She was wild in the way of the mountains, and the hawks, and the land itself. She knew how to survive. She knew how to work. He had been looking at her as a problem to be managed. He had been wrong. That evening, dinner was a thick stew with dumplings. The men ate, again, in a kind of awed silence. The food was not just fuel. It restored something in them. After the meal, Jack found her on the front porch. She was not sitting in the rocker. She was standing at the railing, looking out at the vast, empty darkness. The wind was picking up, and she had the big coat on again. He stood near her. Not too close. The silence stretched. You handled that calf well today, he said finally. She did not look at him. I misjudged you, he said. She turned her head. Her face was a shadow in the dim light from the window. You bought me. Jack nodded, his hands digging into his pockets. He had to fix this. He was a plain man, and he would use plain words. I want to settle that. I paid your fine to Silas. That money, $50. It is a debt. She watched him, her eyes narrowing. I pay Billy $10 a month, plus his keep. I will pay you the same. You cook for us. You help where you see fit. That money, that $50. You can work it off in 5 months. After that, you are free to go. She processed this. He could see her turning the words over. A debt, wages, a date, 5 months. This was language she understood. It was a contract. Or, he added, his voice quieter, you are free to stay on, for wages. He looked away from her, out at the black shapes of the mountains. I do not want to control you. Sarah, this ranch, it is a hard place. My wife, she has been gone a long time. The house has been empty. It just needs tending. I am trying to build a sustainable life here, a peaceful life. I just need help. He had laid his cards on the table. He had offered her terms, not chains. He had told her the truth. She was quiet for a long time. The wind moaned around the corners of the house. 5 months, she said. 5 months, he agreed. She nodded once, a short, sharp gesture. I will work for my keep and my freedom. She turned and went back inside, to her room, the one with the lock. Jack stayed on the porch, listening to the wind. It did not sound quite as lonely as it usually did. A new rhythm settled over the tilted J. It was a tense, quiet rhythm, punctuated by the sharp, clear sounds of Sarah her work. The ranch house had never been so clean. The floors were scrubbed, the windows washed, the persistent dust of the high plains banished. Meals appeared on the table with a silent, clockwork precision. They were hearty, flavorful, and varied. She baked bread that was dark and rich. She made stews that warmed a man from the inside out. She used herbs she gathered from the creek bed, things the men had never even known were edible. But she was a ghost in the house. She spoke only when she had to, her voice low and brief. She did not eat with them. She took her plate after they were finished, eating alone in the kitchen, standing by the sink. She slept in her locked room. Jack, Gus, and Billy found themselves whispering in her presence, as if in church. They were all, in their own way, terrified of her. The tension was not just from her silence. It was from the collision of her world and theirs. Jack, in particular, found himself constantly off balance. He was a man who understood order. His order, fences, property lines, brands, seasons. Sarah operated by a different set of rules, ones he could not read. One afternoon, he rode back from the far pasture to find her on the roof of the house. He nearly stopped breathing. She was on all fours, moving along the ridgepole, her braids swinging. "Sarah!" he roared, his voice cracking with alarm. "Get down from there!" She paused, looking down at him. She was holding a hammer and a handful of wooden shingles. "There is a leak," she said, her voice carrying clear on the wind. "The chimney flashing is rotten. It will come through on your bed." "But how did you—" he stammered. She just turned back to her work, her hammer blows precise and steady. Jack stood by his horse, feeling useless. He was the owner of the ranch. She was the cook. She was fixing his roof. He tried, clumsily, to bridge the gap. He rode into Junction for supplies. While he was there, he stopped at Abernathy, his store. He felt a powerful, awkward urge to give her something to show appreciation. He looked at the bolts of cloth. He remembered her choosing the rough brown duck. He thought, perhaps, she had chosen it only because it was all she felt she deserved. He bought a bolt of soft wool, the color of a summer sky. He bought a small tin of lemon drops. He bought a pair of proper women his leather gloves. He returned to the ranch and left the small pile on the kitchen table while she was outside. He did not say anything, just left it. He heard nothing. That evening, dinner was served as usual. The pile was gone from the table. He felt a small, foolish flicker of pleasure. Later, he found the items outside his own bedroom door. The cloth was neatly folded. The gloves were on top. The tin of lemon drops was beside them. He stared at the pile, baffled. He picked up the gloves. They were his size, not hers. He had bought the wrong ones, a simple mistake. But the cloth. He found her in the kitchen, wiping down the clean counters. You did not want the dress material," he asked, trying to keep the frustration out of his voice. She did not turn around. "I have a dress," she said. "That brown thing, it is, rough. This is softer." Her hand stopped moving. She turned slowly. Her black eyes were not fiery. They were cold as ice. "You bought me," she said, her voice quiet. "You gave me clothes to work in. Now you give me a dress to—" "What, to be pretty, to look like the white women in the town?" Jack recoiled. "That is not— I just thought—" You thought you would dress me up, like a doll, like your—" He saw her eyes flicker past him, to the main room, to the small rocking chair by the hearth, like her. The words hit him like a physical blow. He had never spoken of Mary to her. He had never spoken of Mary to anyone. He took a step back. "I meant no offense," he said, his voice stiff. "You meant to change me," she said. "I am not her. I am not a piece of calico you can cut and sew into something you like. I am your cook. I will work off my debt. That is all." She turned back to the counter. The conversation was over. Jack stood there, holding the blue wool, feeling like the biggest fool in the Wyoming Territory. He had not been trying to change her. Or had he? He looked at his calloused hands. He had been trying to be kind. His kindness had felt, to her, like another kind of chain. He was beginning to see that she was not just a person. She was a person from a different world. And his rules did not apply. The ranch work was hard as autumn deepened. The days grew short, the wind sharp. A new, more tangible threat began to make itself known. Jack rode his fence lines and found a section cut clean, not broken by cattle, but cut with wire nippers. A dozen head of his cattle were gone. He sat at the table that night, rubbing his temples. Gus and Billy were quiet. Who would do it, Billy asked. Jack shook his head. Could be anyone. Rustlers passing through, or... He thought of Marcus Thorne, a rancher over on the next valley, a man with a greedy streak and a lot of hired guns. Thorne had made comments about Jack his water rights before. "We will have to ride the herd closer," Jack said. "Post a watch." Sarah, clearing the plates, paused. She looked at the map Jack had unrolled on the table. "They came from the north," she said. Jack looked up. "How do you know that?" "I saw the tracks. 2 days ago, 3 riders. They were not watching cattle. They were watching the house. They sat on the ridge for an hour." Jack, his blood ran cold. "You saw them. Why in God's name did you not say anything?" She shrugged, picking up the last plate. "You did not ask." Jack stared at her. The sheer, impossible logic of it. She was not his partner. She was his employee. She had not seen it as her business. "Sarah," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "If you see riders again, you tell me. You tell me immediately. That is an order." Her head snapped up. Her eyes flashed. "Order, you do not give me orders. I am not your dog." She was right. He had promised. He was not her master. He took a deep breath, fighting his own temper. "It is not an order," he said, forcing the words out. "It is a request. This is my ranch, my men. We are in danger. If you see something that threatens us, you have to tell me." She held his gaze, challenging him. "You protect your ranch," she said. "I protect myself." She walked into the kitchen. Jack was left shaking with a frustration so deep he could not speak. He wanted to shout. He wanted to shake her. He also knew deep down that she was not wrong. She owed him nothing but her work. The first snow of the season came early. A wet, heavy storm that blew in from the north and trapped them in the ranch house for 2 days. The wind howled, a high, thin scream that sounded human. Gus and Billy stayed in the bunkhouse, tending the horses. Jack found himself alone in the main house with Sarah. The silence was deafening. He sat by the fire, mending a bridle, the leather stiff and cold in his hands. She was in the kitchen, baking. The smell of yeast and molasses filled the air. The sound of the wind was relentless. Jack found himself watching her. She moved with a purpose. She was never still. She cleaned the rifle he kept in the kitchen, her hands moving over the weapon with an easy familiarity. She sharpened every knife in the house, including her own. She was preparing for a siege. On the second night of the storm, the wind was so loud it shook the log walls. Jack was sitting at the table, going over his ledgers, trying to make the numbers make sense. Sarah was sitting on the floor by the hearth, stitching a patch onto her denim trousers. She was the closest he had ever seen her come to sitting still. The wind hit the chimney with a sudden, violent gust. A sound like a woman, his scream echoed down the flue. Sarah flinched. Her whole body went rigid. The needle stopped. Jack looked up. He had seen that look before. It was the look in a horse, his eyes just before it bolted. "It is just the wind," he said, his voice gentle. She did not seem to hear him. She was staring into the fire, but she was not seeing the flames. She was seeing something else. Her face, usually so guarded, was stripped bare. It was pure, naked terror. She began to breathe, fast, shallow breaths. "Sarah," he said, standing up. She scrambled to her feet, backing away from the fire, her hand flying to her belt, to the sheath where she always kept her knife. It was not there. It was on the kitchen counter. Her panic escalated. "My knife," she whispered, her eyes wide, darting around the room. "It is all right," Jack said, keeping his hands open, his voice calm, the way he would soothe a spooked mare. "You are safe. It is just the storm." The wind screamed again. She shook her head, her braid lashing her face. "No," she whispered. It sounds like the fire." He did not understand. What fire? She was trembling, her whole body shaking. She backed up until she hit the wall, her hands flat against the logs. "They came in the night," she said. Her voice was thin. "A child. His voice. We did not hear them until the dogs, and then the fire." Jack froze. He felt like he had stepped through ice. He knew, instinctively, that he had to be completely still. "Who came?" he asked, his voice barely audible. She was not talking to him. She was reliving it. "The white men, from the fort. They said my father stole a cow. But he did not. She pressed her hands to her ears. "The screaming. My mother. They—" Jack felt sick. He had heard stories. Brutal, ugly stories from the Indian Wars. Stories that decent men tried not to believe. "Sarah," he said. "I hid," she whispered, her eyes squeezed shut. "My mother. She pushed me under the floor, into the cache. It was dark. I could smell the smoke. I could hear everything. I was there for 2 days. When I came out, there was nothing, just ashes." A tear traced a clean line through the soot on her cheek. She did not seem to know she was crying. "I was 10 years old. I ran. I have been running ever since." She was sliding down the wall, her legs giving way. Jack moved, fast. He caught her before she hit the floor. She was light in his arms, light as a bird, and shaking so hard he could feel the tremors in his own bones. He did not know what to do. He was a man of action, not of comfort. He half carried, half dragged her to the chair, the simple wooden one, not Mary, her rocker. He sat her down. She was curled in on herself, rocking, making a low, broken sound. He stood over her, his big hands helpless. He looked at the fireplace. The fire, which had been a comfort, now seemed malevolent. He looked at her, this girl, this woman, who had faced down drunkards with a broken bottle, who could gentle a wild cow and fix a roof. He had seen her as strong, as hard, as unbreakable. He had been a fool. Her strength was not stone. It was forged steel, made in a fire he could not even imagine. It was the strength of a survivor, but it had been bought at a terrible price. He did not touch her again. He just stood there, his shadow falling over her. A silent guardian. He let her grieve. He let the storm rage inside and out. After a long time, the shaking subsided. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, her movements angry, ashamed. She looked up at him, her eyes red-rimmed but hardening again, the armor sliding back into place. "You will not speak of this," she said. "It was an order." Jack nodded. "I will not." She stood up, her legs unsteady. She walked to the kitchen, grabbed her knife, and disappeared into her locked room. The click of the lock was loud in the sudden silence. Jack stood by the fire for hours. The storm passed. The wind died. He looked at the empty rocking chair. He thought of his own grief. It was a clean grief. Sadness. Loss. He had buried his wife and child. He had moored them. Her grief. It was dirty. It was full of terror and smoke and shame. She had not just lost her family. They had been stolen from her, violently, and she had been left to run. He had thought of her as a tool, then as a worker, then as a puzzle. He saw her now. He saw the person, forged in that fire. He felt an admiration so profound it ached in his chest. He had wanted a peaceful life, a life without feeling. He had brought this woman into his home, and she was a living, breathing testament to the very worst and the very strongest parts of the human soul. He was not looking for love. But as he stood in the quiet ranch house, he realized he was feeling something, a deep, powerful pull toward her resilience, her pain, her incredible, stubborn strength. It was a feeling that was complicated and dangerous, and more real than anything he had felt in 8 long years. The morning after the storm, the world was scoured clean. The sky was a high, brilliant blue, and the snow on the ground was so bright it hurt the eyes. A profound silence held the ranch. Inside the house, the silence was different. It was heavy, packed with the words that had been spoken in the dark. Jack moved about the kitchen, clumsy, almost fearful of making a sound. He had kept his promise. He had not spoken of what she revealed. He had not looked at her with pity. When she emerged from her room, her face pale but composed, her braid tight, he had simply nodded. "Good morning." She nodded back. But something had broken, or perhaps something had been forged. The invisible wall between them was still there, but it had a door in it now, and they were both aware of it. She was, if possible, even quieter than before. She seemed embarrassed, ashamed of the vulnerability she had shown. Her pride was a tangible thing, and he had seen it crack. She compensated with work. She scrubbed floors that were already clean. She reorganized the pantry, lining up tins like soldiers. She was reclaiming her armor. Jack watched her, his heart a heavy, unfamiliar weight in his chest. He saw her now not as a force of nature, but as a person who had survived an apocalypse. He went about his own work, his mind constantly turning back to her. He found himself thinking, when he was mending a fence, what is she doing now? He found himself listening, when he rode in, for the sound of her moving in the kitchen. Gus and Billy felt the change, too. The house was not just clean, it was tense. Sarah. Her silence was no longer just the quiet of a stranger. It was the quiet of a banked fire. Gus, mending a saddle blanket on the porch, watched her walk to the wood pile. She was not just strong. "Boss," he said quietly to Jack. "She is fierce." Jack just nodded, his gaze following her. She began to change, slowly, in ways only he would notice. She was still bound by her 5-month contract, but her actions spoke of something more permanent. She had cleared the old garden patch. One day, Jack saw her kneeling in the dirt, drawing in the soil with a stick. She was laying out rows. She came to him in the barn, where he was oiling tack. "I need seeds," she said. Jack stopped working. "Seeds. It is almost winter. For the spring," she pointed to the patch. "The soil is good. It needs manure from the stable, but it will grow corn, beans, squash." Jack looked at her. Spring was 4 months away. Her contract would be over in 3. He said nothing. He just nodded. "All right. Next time I ride to Junction, I will get seeds." She did not thank him. She just turned and walked away. But she had planned for a future that included this ranch. She also began to speak, sparingly. Gus, who was the least threatening of the men, found the courage to ask her a question at dinner. "This stew, Miss Sarah," he said, his voice rough with respect. "My grandmother used to make dumplings like this. Where did you learn?" Jack and Billy froze, waiting for the explosion, or the cold silence. Sarah paused in the kitchen doorway. "My mother taught me," she said, her voice low. She learned from her mother. It was nothing. It was everything. She had acknowledged a past, a lineage, a piece of herself that was not born of fire and ash. Gus beamed, his face cracking into 1,000 wrinkles. The tentative peace was shattered a week later. The external threat had been quiet, but it had not gone away. Jack and Billy were riding the north pasture, checking the herd that they had moved closer to home. When they saw the riders, 3 of them, they were sitting on their horses on the ridge, the same ridge Sarah had mentioned. They were just watching. "They are from the Thorn Ranch," Billy said, his voice tight. "I recognize the one on the left. Name is Pete. He is mean." Jack, his hand rested on the Winchester in his saddle scabbard. They were too far to hail, too far for a shot. They were just watching. It was an act of intimidation, a message from Marcus Thorne. This land is being watched. Jack turned his horse. "We are heading back," he said. They rode back, the feeling of being watched prickling their necks. When they got to the ranch yard, the riders were gone. But the message had been delivered. That night, Jack could not sleep. The house was dark. The only sound was the low ticking of the mantel clock Mary had brought from back east. He got up from his bed, pulled on his trousers, and went into the main room. The fire was down to glowing embers. He added a log, poking it until small flames licked up. He sat in the chair, the one he always used, and stared into the fire. The threat from Thorne was real. He had only 2 hands. Gus was old, Billy was fast, but he was just a boy. Jack was a good shot, but he was not a gunfighter. He was a rancher. He felt the familiar, cold grip of worry. He had built this place from nothing. He had buried his wife here. He would not be driven off. He reached for the bottle of whiskey he kept on a low shelf. He poured 2 fingers into a glass. The burn of the alcohol was sharp, but it did not cut the cold inside him. The click of a door latch made him turn. Sarah stood in the hallway, a shadow in the darkness. She was wrapped in the thick wool blanket he had tossed her that first day. He could not see her face. He expected her to go to the kitchen for water, or to retreat back to her room. Instead, she walked slowly into the main room. She stood for a long moment, looking at the fire. "You are worried," she said. It was not a question. Jack swirled the whiskey in his glass. "Those riders today. They work for a man named Thorne. He wants my water. He will likely try to take it." She was silent. Then she did something that stunned him. She walked to the shelf, picked up the only other glass, and held it out. Jack stared at the glass, then at her. He poured. She did not sit in Mary, her rocker. She sat on the floor, on the thick bearskin rug, tucking her legs beneath her. She held the glass in both hands. She was close enough to the fire that the light caught the blue-black sheen of her hair. She sipped the whiskey. She did not cough. She took it like a man, her expression unchanging. Jack drank his own. The silence stretched, but it was not the tense, angry silence of the first weeks. It was a shared quiet. 2 people, awake in the dead of night, sharing a fire, sharing a worry. "You should not have bought that blue cloth," she said, her voice soft. Jack looked at her, surprised. "I know, I am sorry." It was what she would have liked," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The woman who sat in that chair." Jack, his breath caught. He nodded, unable to speak. Sarah looked at the fire. "She was pretty. I saw the picture, on your dresser." Jack had a small daguerreotype of Mary in his room. He had not known Sarah had ever seen it. "She was," he said, his voice rough. "Her name was Mary." They drank. The fire crackled. "Why did you come here?" she asked. "To this place. It is so empty." Jack leaned his head back. He had not told this story to anyone. "My father was a farmer in Ohio. He had 40 acres. He worked himself to death for dirt that grew thin corn. He always talked about the West, about room, a place where a man could see. When he passed, I sold the farm. I just rode west. I rode until I found this valley, this creek. I knew this was the place." He smiled, a small, bitter twist of his lips. "I thought it was paradise. Mary," she tried, but the wind, the quiet, it wore her down. She was not made for this place. Sarah was quiet. She looked at her glass. "No one is made for this place," she said. "You have to make yourself for it. Like iron, you have to be hammered and put in the fire." Jack looked at her, at the side of her face illuminated by the flames. He was seeing the iron. "And you?" he asked, his voice gentle, not pushing. She shrugged. "I ran. For years, I worked in towns. I washed dishes. I sewed clothes. I learned to be invisible. But they always see you. The men, they always see you." She took another sip of whiskey. "I learned to fight. I learned to be meaner than they were. It was the only way." "We all have to fight," Jack said. She shook her head. "Not like that. You fight for things, for land, for cattle. I fight for breath, just to be left alone." He had no answer to that. They sat for a long time. The log in the fireplace collapsed, sending up a shower of bright orange sparks. He was intensely aware of her, the smell of her hair, clean, smoky, the strength in her hands as she held the glass. He had come here for a cook. He had wanted simple meals. He had found this woman, forged in fire, who sat by his hearth and drank his whiskey and spoke truths that cut to the bone. He poured a little more into both their glasses. The title of that story in the saloon, sweeter than any whiskey. He had thought it foolish. Now, sitting here, sharing this quiet, desperate moment with her, he understood. The simple, raw honesty of her presence, the connection he felt to her survival. It was a warmth the whiskey could not touch. She looked up at him, her eyes catching the firelight. "You are a good man, Jack Donovan. You are sad, but you are not weak." He did not know what to say. He just nodded. She finished her drink and stood up in one fluid motion. She placed the empty glass on the mantel. "Good night," she said. And she was gone, back to her room. The lock clicked. Jack sat by the fire until the first gray light of dawn touched the windows. He felt different. He was still worried about Thorn, but he was no longer alone in it. The attack came 3 days later. It was not a subtle. In the dark raid, they came at dusk. 4 riders. They rode straight into the ranch yard. Bold, arrogant. Jack, Gus, and Billy were in the corral, finishing the evening feed. Marcus Thorn was not with them. He had sent his dogs. It was Pete, the mean one Billy had recognized, and 3 others. They were rough men, with guns tied low on their hips. "Evening, Donovan," Pete called out, his voice a sneer. He stopped his horse in the middle of the yard. "Nice little setup you have here." "What do you want?" Pete Jack said, walking slowly out of the corral. Gus and Billy fanned out behind him. They were not wearing their rifles. It had happened too fast. "Mr. Thorn is worried about you," Pete said, grinning, showing yellow teeth. "Worried your cattle might be thirsty. He is prepared to make you an offer for this dry piece of ground." "This land is not for sale," Jack said. Pete, his grin faded. "That is the wrong answer, Mr. Thorn. He is a reasonable man, but he does not like to be told no." One of the other men uncoiled his rope. He lazily looped it over one of the posts of the porch. The post Sarah had reinforced. With a jerk, he spurred his horse back. The post snapped at the base, the porch roof sagging with a groan. "That is just a little friendly persuasion," Pete said. Jack's face was white with rage. "Get off my land." Pete spat in the dirt. "Or what, old man, you and these 2? He was right. They were outmanned and outgunned. This was just intimidation. This time. "Stop," a voice said. It was not loud, but it cut through the twilight air. Pete and his men turned. Sarah stood on the ruined porch. She was not wearing the heavy coat. She was in her shirt and trousers. She was holding a bow. Jack's mouth went dry. He had never seen it before. It was not a simple, rough bow. It was a beautiful, powerful thing. Dark wood, recurved. In her other hand, she held an arrow, its point a glint of dark stone. Pete and his men laughed. "Well, look at this," Pete sneered. "Donovan is squaw. What are you going to do with that? Little girl shoot a rabbit." Sarah knocked the arrow. She drew the string. Her motion was not rushed. It was smooth, ancient, and absolutely deadly. She did not aim at Pete. She aimed at the hat of the man who had pulled down the porch. The bowstring sang. The air split. The arrow moved so fast it was just a blur. The man, his hat was plucked from his head, pinning it to the wall of the barn, 20 yards behind him. The arrow had passed less than an inch from his ear. The man yelped, his hand flying to his head. The yard went dead silent. No one laughed. Pete, his face was pale. The other men looked at Sarah, their eyes wide with superstitious fear. A woman, an Indian, with a bow, and a shot like that. I said. Sarah repeated, her voice low. Lethal. I will not miss the next one. Leave. Pete looked at Jack. He looked at the arrow quivering in the barn wall. He looked back at Sarah. She was already drawing a second arrow from a quiver Jack had not even seen. This is not over. Donovan, Pete spat, but his voice had lost its brav git. He wheeled his horse, and the 4 men galloped out of the yard, disappearing into the growing dark. Jack, Gus, and Billy stood frozen. Billy walked over to the barn wall and tried to pull the arrow out. It was sunk deep, vibrating with power. Gus just took off his hat and wiped his brow. Jack walked slowly toward the porch. Sarah was still standing there, the bow in her hand. She was breathing hard, the adrenaline fading. She looked at the ruined porch post. She was not just a helper. She was not just a cook. She was a warrior. And she had just, without hesitation, defended his home, her home. The thrumming of the arrow in the barn wall was the only sound in the twilight. It was a low, angry vibration that seemed to fill the entire ranch yard. Pete and his men were gone, swallowed by the dusk, leaving behind only the smell of their horses and a sharp, coppery tang of fear. Gus let out a long breath, which turned to a white plume in the cold air. He slowly put his hat back on his head. Billy, his face pale, was still staring at the arrow. He walked over to it, as if in a trance, and touched the fletching. Boss, he whispered. It went clean through the wood. Jack did not hear him. He was looking at Sarah. She was still on the porch, the bow held loosely at her side. The adrenaline was draining from her, leaving her trembling, but her stance was unbroken. She looked at the ruined porch post, then at the barn, then at Jack. Her face was impossible to read, but her eyes were still burning. She had not just revealed a skill. She had revealed a part of her soul. She had shown them the iron. Jack finally moved. He walked out of the corral, his boots heavy in the dirt. He stopped at the foot of the porch. He did not know what to say. Thank you felt small, stupid. He was a rancher. She was his cook. She had just declared war on Marcus Thorne to protect his property. He looked at the bow. It was beautiful, smooth, dark wood, wrapped in sinew. It was not a toy. It was a weapon of war. Where did you get that? He asked, his voice rough. It was my father, she said. She looked down at it, her fingers tracing the curve. I have had it since the fire. I keep it hidden. Jack nodded, absorbing this. He had seen her as a victim, a survivor, a hard worker. He had been blind. He had been standing next to an apex predator, and he had been trying to hand her a dish towel. He looked up at the dark ridge. They will be back, he said. It was not a question. She nodded. Yes, and they will not come to talk. He looked at Gus and Billy. His men, they were loyal, but they were not gunfighters. Gus was old, his hands stiff. Billy was young, his courage untested in a real fight. And Jack was just a man who wanted to be left alone. He made a decision. It was fast, and it was total. He turned back to Sarah. He was no longer her employer. He hoped, her partner. How many arrows? He asked. She looked surprised by the directness of the question. By the inclusion. 12, maybe more, and I have... She hesitated. Materials. Jack nodded. Good, get them. He turned to his men. Billy, Gus, they are coming. Tonight. We do not have time to run, and we have nowhere to run to. We hold the house. Gus, his face hardened. He nodded once. The Tilted J is our home, boss. We hold it. Billy looked scared, but he firmed his jaw. "Yes, sir." The next hour was a blur of frantic, focused activity. They were no longer 3 men and a woman. They were a garrison. Jack and Billy emptied the bunkhouse, bringing the rifles, all the ammunition, blankets, and a barrel of water into the main house. They barred the doors. Gus, who was steady under pressure, began barricading the windows with the heavy tables and dressers, leaving small, protected slits for firing. The log house, which Jack had built with his own hands, was now a fortress. Sarah worked alone. She disappeared into her room. When she came out, she was not the same woman. She was wearing her trousers and shirt, but she had a thick leather quiver strapped to her back. She carried the bow in one hand, and her knife was strapped to her forearm, not her belt. Her face was stripped of all emotion except a cold, hard focus. Jack watched as she went to the fireplace and retrieved a small, soot-covered buckskin bag he had never seen before. She sat on the floor, ignoring the chaos, and opened it. Inside were dark, glistening stones, obsidian, flint, and tools for shaping them. She was not just a warrior, she was an armorer. She began checking her arrows, replacing a dulled practice head with a lethally sharp, flaked stone point. Her hands were a blur, fast and sure. Jack finished shuttering the last window. The house was dark, lit only by a single lantern turned down low. The smell of gun oil and fear was thick in the room. He walked over to her. She looked up, her eyes catching the lamplight. "You take the back window," he said, "the one from your room. It overlooks the creek bed. If they are smart, they will send a man that way, to try for the back door." She just nodded, accepting the assignment. She picked up her bow and the quiver and vanished into the darkness of the hallway. The click of her door was absent. She had left it open. Jack took the front window, nearest the porch. Gus took the other. Billy, the youngest, was given the job of reloading. He had 3 rifles lined up on the main table, boxes of cartridges beside them. They waited. The silence was worse than the storm had been. It was a heavy, crushing weight. The moon was rising, a pale, cold sliver that cast long, black shadows across the snow-patched yard. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind, made them jump. Jack's palms were sweating. He wiped them on his trousers. He thought of Mary. He thought of the quiet life he had wanted. He looked at the closed door to his own room. He felt a deep, profound sadness, and then he felt the rage. They would not take this from him. He had lost one family here. He would not lose this house. It happened just after midnight. A single flicker of light from the direction of the barn. Gus hissed, "Boss." Jack saw it. "They are trying to light the barn, to draw us out. Hold your fire. Do not shoot at shadows. Wait." The flicker grew. A tongue of orange flame licked up the dry side of the barn. "Damn them," Billy whispered, his voice trembling. The fire grew, bright and hungry, painting the ranch yard in a terrible, flickering red light. It made the house a perfect target. And then the shooting started. It came from all sides, a barrage of rifle shots. Bullets slammed into the log walls with sickening, heavy thuds. Wood splintered. A shot found the window by Gus, showering the old man with glass fragments. "Return fire!" Jack roared, the command breaking the tension. He shoved his rifle through the slit and fired at a muzzle flash near the corral. Gus fired a moment later. The night exploded into a chaos of noise, smoke, and thunder. "They are moving!" Gus shouted. To the porch. Jack saw them. 4 men, running low, using the firelight as cover, heading for the front of the house. They were carrying something. Oil cans. They were going to burn them out. Jack fired, levered his rifle, fired again. He saw one man spin and fall, but the others were too close. They reached the porch, shielded by the wall. "Fire!" Billy yelled, his voice high. "The front porch is on fire." Jack could smell it now. the acrid smell of lamp oil, and then the whoosh of the flames. Smoke began to curl under the door. He turned from the window. "We have to put it out." He grabbed the water barrel, but as he moved, the back door of the house burst open with a crash of splintered wood. A massive figure filled the doorway. It was Pete. He had a pistol in his hand, and his face was a mask of rage. He had come up the creek bed, just as Jack had predicted. Jack's rifle was empty. Gus was pinned at his window. Billy screamed. A sound split the air. Not a gunshot. A low, sharp thwack. Pete stopped. He looked down. An arrow, fletched in dark feathers, was buried in his chest, clear to the shaft. His eyes went wide with shock. He looked up, past Jack, into the dark hallway. He did not make a sound. He just collapsed, his pistol clattering on the floor. Sarah stepped out of the hallway. She did not have her bow. She had her knife in her hand. Her face was terrible. A warrior, his visage. She had been prepared to fight him hand to hand. The fire on the porch roared. The room was filling with smoke. The shooting from outside intensified. They were trapped. "We are finished," Gus choked, coughing. "They will burn us alive." "No," Sarah said. Her voice was not a whisper. It was a command. She ran past Jack, not to the water barrel, but to the front door. It was barred, but the wood was already scorching hot. "Jack," she yelled, "open it!" "What are you, insane? They will shoot us to pieces." "They will shoot us anyway. Open it. We fight or we burn." She was right. It was a choice between two kinds of death. Jack looked at her. Her eyes were alive, brilliant with a terrible, beautiful fire. He was not just fighting for his land. He was fighting for her. He grabbed his rifle. "Billy, reload Gus. Cover us." He threw the heavy bar off the door. The firelight hit them like a blow. The porch was an inferno. Beyond it, he could see three men reloading, their faces lit by the flames, their expressions triumphant. Sarah did not hesitate. She grabbed the rifle from Jack's hands. He had thought she was a creature of the bow, of the knife. He was wrong. She was a survivor. She knew all weapons. She stepped into the doorway, framed by the fire. She did not panic. She planted her feet. She raised the rifle. She fired. The man in the center, the one holding the oil can, dropped. She levered the weapon, the motion smooth and practiced. She fired again. A second man cried out, clutching his shoulder. Jack was frozen for a second, watching her. This was not the woman who hid from the wind. This was the fire itself. Her action broke his paralysis. He grabbed the rifle Gus held out to him. He stepped up beside her. They stood side by side in the burning doorway. Jack and Sarah, shoulder to shoulder. They were not a rancher and a cook. They were a single, unified force. They fired as one. Jack aimed, fired, levered, fired. Sarah, beside him, was just as fast, just as steady. The remaining two men, who had expected terrified victims to run out, were met by a wall of disciplined, repeating gunfire. They had not counted on this. They had not counted on the old man firing steadily from the window. And they had certainly not counted on the Indian woman, standing in the heart of the fire, dealing death with a Winchester. One of them screamed and ran, disappearing into the darkness. The last man, the one Sarah had hit, tried to raise his pistol. Jack his shot and Gus his shot hit him at the same time. He fell and did not move. Silence. The only sound was the roar of the fire on the porch. The barn was a collapsing inferno. The porch was moments from taking the whole house. "The fire!" Jack yelled, his voice hoarse. The battle was over. The fight for survival began. Jack grabbed the water barrel and heaved it, splashing the water onto the burning doorframe. Gus and Billy grabbed buckets. Sarah, dropping the rifle, was already in the kitchen, grabbing every pot, every pan, filling them from the emergency barrel. For the next 10 minutes, they fought the fire. They were a frantic, desperate team. They threw water. They beat the flames with blankets. They stamped out embers. Jack used an axe to chop away the burning porch flooring, creating a firebreak. Finally, it was over. The fire was out. The porch was a smoking, ruined mess. The barn was a pile of glowing coals. The ranch yard was littered with dark shapes. But the house stood. They stood in the yard, 4 figures black with soot, illuminated by the dying glow of the barn. They were breathing in harsh, ragged gasps. Gus was leaning on the corral fence, his face gray with exhaustion. Billy was sitting on the ground, shaking. Jack looked at Sarah. Her braid was gone, her hair a wild black mane around her face. There was a long, bloody scratch on her cheek. She was covered in dirt and ashes. She looked utterly, terrifyingly beautiful. He walked over to her. He was shaking, not from fear, but from a new, powerful emotion. He had wanted a cook. He had wanted peace. He had found a warrior. He had found a partner. He reached out his hand, not to touch her, but as if to prove she was real. "You," he started, his voice a rasp. He could not find the words. He swallowed, his throat raw from smoke. "You saved us. You saved this house." Sarah looked at the ruined porch. She looked at the smoking bodies in the yard. She looked at the house, which stood, scarred but whole, against the night sky. Then she looked at him. Her eyes, in the dim light, were not cold. They were not fiery. They were deep, exhausted, and profoundly alive. She nodded, a small, tired movement. "We saved it," she said. That one word, "we," it hung in the cold, smoky air between them. It was a word that changed everything. It was a word that sealed a contract far deeper than any debt. It was the sound of 2 solitary people becoming something else. The word hung in the smoky air. "We..." Jack looked at the woman before him. She was covered in soot, her hair wild, a bloody scratch on her cheek. The ruins of his ranch were all around them. The barn was a heap of glowing coals. The porch was a blackened, skeletal wreck. The bodies of the men who had attacked them were dark shapes in the yard. The air stank of smoke, gunpowder, and death. Gus was leaning heavily against the corral, his chest heaving, his face the color of ash. Billy was on his knees, dry retching from the shock and the smoke. They were alive, but they were not safe. Jack knew, with a certainty that settled cold in his stomach, that this was not over. This was only the first wave. This was the opening salvo. He looked at Sarah. She was looking at the dark ridge to the north, the same ridge where she had first spotted the riders. She was listening, not with her ears, but with her whole body. "He will come," Jack said, his voice a raw rasp. She nodded, not looking at him. "Yes, he sent his men to do a job. They failed. He will come to finish it." Jack looked at the house. It was scarred, but it stood. It was also a death trap. The front was a gaping, burned hole. The windows were shattered. They could not defend it again. "Gus! Billy!" he called out, his voice taking on a new authority, one he had not known he possessed. "Get the rifles, all the ammunition. Get the water bags from the kitchen. We are leaving the house." Gus looked at him, confused. "Boss, where are we going?" Sarah answered. She pointed with her chin toward the ridge. "Up there, to the rocks. We can see the valley from there. It is the high ground. It is the only ground." Jack looked at her, and a profound, burning admiration flooded his chest. She was right. She was thinking, while they were just reacting. She was a survivor. "Let us move," Jack commanded. "We have minutes." The next few minutes were a blur of desperate action. They were not 4 separate people. They were a unit, bound by the battle they had just survived. Billy, his fear giving way to adrenaline, scrambled to collect the boxes of cartridges. Gus, his joints aching, filled the canteens and water bags. Jack grabbed the 2 remaining Winchesters and his own heavy coat. Sarah was already gone. She had retrieved her bow and her quiver. She ran to the collapsed corral, her movements fluid and fast. She returned with 4 long, stout ropes. She was not just a warrior, she was a planner. They met at the back of the house, by the broken door where Pete had fallen. The body was still there. They stepped over it without looking. "We go up the creek bed," Sarah said. "It will hide us until the last climb." She took the lead. She did not run. She moved in a low, ground-eating crouch, her bow in her hand. Jack, his rifle ready, followed her. Gus and Billy, loaded with supplies, brought up the rear. The climb was brutal. They were exhausted, their lungs burning from smoke. The creek bed was rocky, and in the dark, they stumbled, their boots slipping on wet stones. Gus fell once, a heavy, gasping fall, and Jack had to haul him to his feet. "Come on, old man," Jack urged, his voice gentle but firm. Not much further. Gus just gritted his teeth and nodded, his loyalty stronger than his exhaustion. Sarah found the path up the ridge. It was barely a deer trail, steep and treacherous. She seemed to know it by instinct. She climbed, using her hands, pulling herself up, the bow now slung over her back. Jack felt his muscles screaming. He looked down at the ranch. It looked small, a child, his plaything. The dying fire of the barn, a single red eye in the darkness. They reached the rocks just as the first, sick, gray light of dawn began to stain the eastern sky. It was a perfect fortress, a tumble of massive granite boulders forming a natural, protected nest. It was the very spot where Pete and his men had sat, watching the ranch. Sarah directed them, her voice low. "Billy, here, you can see the yard. Gus, you watch the trail we just came up. Jack." She looked at him. "You and I will take the front." They settled in, the cold stone seeping into their clothes. There was no talking. There was only waiting. Jack found his hands were steady. The fear was gone. He was no longer a man grieving his past, hiding from the world. He was a man with something to protect. He looked at Gus, who was coughing silently into his kerchief but held his rifle steady. He looked at Billy, who was methodically loading every weapon. His fear burned away, leaving a hard, grim focus. And he looked at Sarah. She was kneeling beside him, her body perfectly still. She had laid out 6 arrows. Her rifle was beside her. She was watching the valley. He realized, in that cold gray light, what he was feeling. It was not just admiration. It was not just respect. He had thought love was a soft thing, a thing of warm kitchens and calico dresses, the thing he had lost with Mary. He was wrong. Love was this. It was this fierce, terrible, beautiful thing. It was the respect he felt for her strength. It was the acceptance of her past, the fire and the ashes that had forged her. It was the certain knowledge that he would stand between her and any bullet. He did not want to change her, to tame her, to put her in a blue dress. He needed her exactly as she was, this woman of iron and shadow. He had found his equal. He loved her. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, a quiet explosion in his chest. She heard him take a breath. She turned her head, her eyes meeting his. In the dim light, she saw the change in his face. She saw the raw emotion, the thing he had just discovered. Her own expression softened. Just for a second, there was fear in her eyes, but not of the battle to come. It was the fear of a new, terrifying vulnerability. Then her gaze hardened. She looked back at the valley. "They come," she whispered. Jack looked. A dark line of riders was moving fast from the north. Not 4, not 5. There were at least a dozen. They were riding hard, fanned out, a small army. At their head was a large man on a powerful black horse. Marcus Thorne. Jack said he came himself. The riders poured into the yard. They stopped, their horses milling nervously around the smoking ruins. Thorne dismounted. He walked over to the body of Pete, his movements stiff with rage. He looked at the other bodies. He looked at the burned house, the dead barn. Jack raised his rifle. "Wait," Sarah whispered. "Let them get comfortable." Thorne turned, his big voice booming across the yard, echoing off the ridge. Donovan, he roared. You are a dead man. You hear me? I am tearing this place apart, stick by stick. He believed they were still inside, hiding or dead. He gestured to his men. Find them, burn what is left. The men dismounted, spreading out, arrogant and loud. They were not expecting a fight. They were a mob, come to finish a job. Now, Jack said. 4 rifles spoke from the ridge. The sound was one single, deafening crack. It was a perfect ambush. 4 of Thorn's men, caught in the open, fell before they even knew where the shots had come from. The yard exploded into chaos. The remaining men scrambled for cover, firing wildly at the house, at the shadows, at anything. Thorn roared in fury, realizing he had been tricked. He saw the muzzle flashes from the rocks. Up there, he screamed, pointing, they are in the rocks, get them! But his men were panicked. They were ranchers, not soldiers, and they were caught in a killing ground. Gus, steady, fired again. Another man went down. Billy, his fear gone, was firing fast, working the lever of his rifle. Sarah was not firing fast. She was shooting like a hunter. She took her time. She breathed. She squeezed the trigger. A man trying to hide behind the water trough slumped forward. Every time her rifle cracked, a man fell. Thorn saw his force melting. He was a man of pure, animal rage. He would not be beaten by a broken-down old rancher. He grabbed his rifle from his horse. He pointed at Jack. Donovan, he bellowed, his voice raw. This is between you and me. He raised his rifle, but Jack was already firing. The shot went wide. Thorn fired back. A bullet screamed off the rock beside Jack's head, sending stinging chips of stone into his face. Thorn began to run, using the corral fence for cover, zigzagging, trying to get a clear shot. 2 of his men, loyal or terrified, followed him. Gus and Billy pinned down the other riders. This was it, the final move. Thorn was fast. He was heading for the creek bed, the very path they had taken. If he got there, he could circle, come up behind them. Jack stood up, exposing himself. He had to stop him. He aimed, but Thorn was moving too erratically. A man beside Thorn raised his rifle, aiming at Jack. A flash of movement from beside Jack. Sarah. She had dropped her rifle. She had her bow. An arrow was knocked. She drew, sighed out a breath. The bowstring sang. The man beside Thorn stopped. He looked down at the arrow in his stomach. He sat down, hard, and did not get up. Thorn saw it. He stopped, his face a mask of disbelief. He looked up at the rocks, at the woman with the bow. Jack did not hesitate. He had his shot. He fired. The bullet hit Thorn square in the chest. The big man staggered. He looked down at his own chest, then back at Jack. He did not fall. He was a beast, impossible to kill. He raised his rifle one last time. Jack was fumbling, trying to reload. He was too slow. The second thwack was quieter. Thor _now his head snapped back. He clutched at his throat. An arrow. Sarah, his second arrow, was buried there. His eyes were wide with a final, shocked understanding. He dropped his rifle. He took one step, and then he fell, face down, in the dirt. The yard went utterly silent. The remaining riders, seeing their leader dead, their numbers broken, threw down their weapons. They scrambled for their horses. They fled, riding south, not even looking back. It was over. The sun was climbing over the ridge, flooding the valley with clean, golden light. The air was cold, sharp. Below them, their ranch was a ruin, but they were alive. Gus limped over. He put a trembling hand on Jack's shoulder. We did it, boss. By God, we did it. Billy remained at his post, his rifle across his knees, staring into the distance, his face blank with shock. Jack turned. He turned to Sarah. She was lowering the bow. Her arms were trembling, the adrenaline finally leaving her. Her face was pale beneath the soot. She had killed, again, to protect this place, to protect him. He looked at her, and his heart felt like it would burst. He saw all of it. The 10-year-old girl hiding in the dark, the woman in the saloon with a broken bottle, the warrior standing in the fire, the partner who had just saved his life. Twice, he saw her pain, her strength, her absolute, unbreakable integrity. "Sarah," he said. His voice was thick. She looked at him. Her defenses were down. Her eyes were wide, exhausted, and full of a terror that had nothing to do with the fight. She was afraid of him, afraid of what he saw. He stepped toward her. He did not think. He just acted. He put his hand on her face, his calloused, dirty thumb brushing the soot from her cheek. She did not flinch. She did not pull away. Her eyes closed, just for a second, and she leaned into his touch, a movement so small he almost missed it. It was a gesture of complete surrender, not to him but to the moment. He pulled her to him. It was not gentle. It was rough, desperate. It was the collision of two people who had been alone their entire lives and had just fought their way, side by side, out of hell. He kissed her. It was not a soft kiss. It was a claiming. It tasted of smoke, gunpowder, and desperation. It was the end of the battle, the end of the loneliness, the end of the long, cold years. It was a promise, made in the ruins, under the morning sun. It was fierce, and it was deep, and it was real. She was stiff for only a second. Then, with a sound, a small, broken sigh, she kissed him back. Her arms, so strong, so deadly, came up around his neck. She gripped his shirt, holding on to him as if he were the only solid thing in a world that had always tried to tear her apart. They broke apart, breathing hard, their foreheads resting against each other. The sun was warm on their faces. The battle was over. The war for their lives had just been won. The kiss ended, but they did not move. They remained on the high ridge, their foreheads pressed together, surrounded by the cold, clean air of the new morning. The sun was higher now, a bright, unforgiving light that illuminated the devastation in the valley below. The sounds were small, stark, the caw of a distant raven, the low, sobbing cough from Gus, the metallic click of Billy, pointlessly reloading a rifle. Jack and Sarah finally broke apart, but he kept his hands on her arms, as if to steady himself. They were both trembling, the adrenaline of the fight and the shock of the kiss leaving them exposed, raw. They looked at each other, truly looked. For the first time, there was no smoke, no fire, no shadows. There was just the man, his face etched with exhaustion, grief, and a fierce, new tenderness, and the woman, her face streaked with blood and soot, her eyes wide, unguarded, and full of a terrifying, new light. Gus limped over, his face a gray mask of pain. "Boss, they are gone! The ones who ran!" Jack tore his eyes from Sarah, the spell breaking. He nodded, his voice thick. "I see them." He turned to the old man. "Gus, you are hurt." Gus waved a hand, a gesture of pain dismissal. "Just my leg, twisted it on the climb, and my chest, the smoke," he coughed, a deep, rattling sound. Jack put a hand on his shoulder. "You did well, old friend. You held the line." He looked at Billy, who was still sitting, staring at the valley. "Billy," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Son, it is over." Billy looked up, his eyes blank, uncomprehending. He was a boy who had been forced into manhood in the space of a single night. Jack knew he had to move, to take charge, but he was no longer just a boss. He was part of something else. He looked at Sarah. He did not give an order. He asked, "What now?" Sarah looked down at the ranch, her home, the word she had used. We go down," she said, her voice quiet, rough. "We see what is left." The descent was a slow, painful pilgrimage. They were not a victorious garrison. They were 4 survivors, battered and drained. Gus leaned heavily on Billy, who seemed to come back to himself by having a task, his young face set in a grim mask. Jack and Sarah walked side by side, not touching, but the space between them was electric, a palpable thing. They had stood together in fire. They had kissed. They did not know how to be a rancher and a cook anymore. They reached the yard. The rising sun revealed the full, ugly scope of the ruin. The bodies were sprawled where they had fallen. The barn was a black, smoking skeleton. The porch was gone, a charcoal scar against the log wall. The house itself was savaged, the windows empty, the front door a burned hole. Jack stopped, his heart sinking. He had poured 10 years of his life into this land. He had buried his wife here. He had almost lost it all. He had lost it all. "No," a voice said beside him. He turned. Sarah was not looking at the destruction. She was looking at the house. "The walls stand," she said. "The foundation is stone. The chimney is stone. The rest is just wood." She walked past him, her head high, stepping over the ruined porch beams and disappearing into the dark, smoky interior of the house. Gus spat in the dirt. "She is right, boss. The bones are good." Jack looked at the bodies of Thorne and his men. This was the first grim task. "Gus, Billy, we have to clean this up." Gus nodded grimly. Billy swallowed, his face pale, but he nodded too. They set about the terrible work. They could not bury them here, not on the ranch. They brought the wagon, the one Sarah had ridden in on, and began the heavy, grim task of loading the bodies of their enemies. Jack worked with a numb, mechanical efficiency. He felt nothing for these men, only a profound weariness. As they worked, Sarah emerged from the house. She had a bucket of water. She walked to the wall of the barn, the one where her first arrow had quivered, and began to wash the soot from the stone. She was cleaning. She was making order. When they were finished, the wagon was full. Jack looked at Gus. "Take them to Junction," he said. "Take Billy with you. Tell the sheriff. Tell him what happened. Tell him Thorne attacked us, and we defended our home." Gus looked at him, his old eyes sharp. He understood. Jack was not just getting rid of the bodies, he was sending them away. "What about you?" Boss Gus asked, his gaze flickering to Sarah, who was now scrubbing the bloodstains from the porch. "I am staying," Jack said. "I have to guard the ranch." Gus nodded, a slow, understanding smile touching his lips for the first time. "Aye, you do that. We will. We will be back by tomorrow, or the next day." He and Billy hitched the horses, their movements slow, exhausted. They climbed onto the wagon. Gus looked back, not at Jack, but at Sarah. "Good shot, Miss Sarah," he said, and tipped his hat. She paused, bucket in hand, and simply nodded at him. The wagon creaked, rolled out of the yard, and disappeared over the ridge. Jack and Sarah were alone. The silence that fell was profound. There was nothing but the sound of the wind moving through the broken windows and the slow scrape of Sarah, her brush. Jack walked into the house. The main room was a wreck, overturned furniture, shattered glass, the smell of smoke. The kitchen, however, was mostly untouched. Sarah had already put the table upright. He sat down, heavily, at the table. He was bone-tired, every muscle in agony. He had never felt so old and so alive. He watched her. She finished outside, came in, and walked to the stove. It was cold. She cleaned it. She laid new kindling. She found the coffee pot, which was miraculously unbroken, and began to make coffee. The simple, domestic act, after the night of savagery, was the most profoundly comforting thing he had ever witnessed. She worked without speaking. She found a tin of biscuits. She found some smoked jerky. She brought the food and 2 mugs of steaming black coffee to the table. She placed one in front of him. And then, for the first time, she sat down, across from him. She did not retreat to the counter. She sat at his table, a partner. They ate in silence. The food was just fuel. But the coffee was life. He drank, the scalding liquid cutting through the smoke and ash in his throat. He looked at her. Her face was clean now, but the scratch on her cheek was a bright red line. Her black hair was loose, tangled. She looked exhausted and beautiful. "The barn is gone," he said, his voice flat. "Half the herd is probably scattered. The house, we will rebuild," she said, her voice quiet but firm. She was not looking at him. She was looking at her hands, which were raw from scrubbing. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. She flinched, her whole body tensing, but she did not pull away. Her hand was small, hard, capable. "Sarah," he said. She finally looked up. Her eyes were dark, full of questions. "That debt," he said, "the $50, it is paid. You know that." She nodded. "You are free. You have been free since, well, for a long time. You can go, you can take my horse, you can take whatever money I have. You can go anywhere you want." He had to say it. He had to offer her the freedom she had craved, the freedom she had fought for. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. His hand, on top of hers, was trembling slightly. She looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She saw the truth there. He was not trying to trick her. He was not trying to chain her. He was letting her go. "Where would I go?" she asked, her voice a whisper. He had no answer. "I ran," she said. She pulled her hand from under his, but only to wrap it around her mug. "I have been running since I was 10. I ran from the fire. I ran from the towns. I ran from men like Silas. I ran from everything." She looked around the ruined kitchen. "I came here, and I stopped running." She looked back at him. "Here's. I did not run. I fought." Jack, his heart felt like it was going to stop. You kissed me," she said, stating the fact, her eyes searching his. "I did," he said, his voice thick. "Why?" Jack leaned forward. He had to find the words, the plain, true words. "When she passed, I thought love was gone. I thought it was a soft thing, a gentle thing, something for quiet houses and warm fires and blue dresses. I did not want it. It hurt too much." He looked at her, his gaze unwavering. "I was wrong. Love is not soft. It is not gentle. It is strong. It is iron. It is standing in a burning doorway with someone. It is watching them face down their own demons. It is respect. Sarah, a respect so deep it aches. I do not want to change you. I do not want to put you in a dress. I want—" He stopped, his own vulnerability terrifying him. "I want the woman who gentled my cattle, the woman who fixed my roof, the woman who stood in the rocks with me and saved my life. I love that woman." The word hung in the air. Love. She stared at him, her face pale. She shook her head, a small, scared movement. "You do not know me," she said. I am full of fire and ash. I am not like her. I am not Mary." "I know," he said, his voice urgent. "That is the point. I am not the same man I was when I loved Mary. This land, this life, it changed me. And you woke me up. I do not want Mary. I want you, Sarah, just as you are." She was silent for a long time. She looked out the broken window, at the harsh, beautiful, unforgiving land. "My mother," she said, her voice distant. "She used to plant her garden. The 3 sisters, corn, beans, and squash. She said they were stronger together. The corn grows tall, and the beans climb it. The squash covers the ground, and keeps the weeds out, and holds the water in. They are different, but they help each other. They make each other more." She looked at him. Her eyes were clear. "I am not corn. Jack, I am I am the rocks. I am the hawk. And I am the pine, he said, understanding. I am stubborn, I am rooted, but I am lonely. A small, slow smile touched her lips. It was the first true smile he had ever seen from her. It transformed her face. You are a fool. Jack Donovan, she said softly. I am, he agreed. She took a breath. This debt, it is not paid. Jack started to protest, but she held up a hand. I owe you for the blue cloth, she said. He was baffled. What? It was a kind thought. From a good man. I have never had a kind thought from a good man before. She reached across the table and, this time, it was her hand that covered his. Her touch was light, but it was a brand. I will stay, she said. I will stay and work. The garden, it needs planting. You still owe me those seeds. Jack, his throat was too tight to speak. He just nodded, his eyes stinging with a relief so profound it was painful. She held his gaze, her own steady, strong. We will rebuild. Together, we will make it more. He turned his hand over and laced his fingers with hers. Her grip was strong. It was the grip of a partner, a warrior, a survivor. It was the hand of the woman he loved. The ashes of the barn were still smoking, but in the ruins of the ranch house, at a kitchen table, two scarred and solitary people had just, quietly, begun to build a future. The wagon carrying Gus and Billy disappeared over the ridge, leaving a profound, ringing silence in its wake. The sun was high, beating down on the ruined ranch. Jack and Sarah stood alone in the yard, two small figures in a vast, scarred landscape. The bodies were gone, but the ghosts remained. Jack looked at the house. He had built it for Mary. He had hidden in it after she was gone. He had defended it with Sarah. Now it was a hollowed-out shell, smelling of wet ash and smoke. He felt Sarah, his eyes on him. He turned. She was waiting for him to lead, to be the boss. But the rules had changed. He walked over to the burned hole that had been his porch. He kicked at a charred beam. It collapsed into a pile of black dust. Where do we start? He asked. His voice was flat, exhausted. Sarah looked at the house, her gaze practical, assessing. She walked past him, into the dark interior. He heard her moving around, the crunch of broken glass under her boots. She came back out a moment later. She was carrying a broom, one he had not even known they owned. We start here, she said. She began to sweep the soot and glass from the threshold. It was a simple act. It was the most profound answer he could have received. He watched her for a moment. She was not waiting for him. She was working. He felt a slow, answering resolve build in him. He walked to the shed, which had been spared by the fire. He grabbed an axe and a shovel. They worked all day. They did not talk. They did not need to. The language they shared now was one of action. He was a man of wood and muscle. He began clearing the wreckage of the porch, chopping away the burned timbers. His axe swings heavy and rhythmic. She was a woman of order. She swept the entire house. She gathered the broken glass. She took the soot-stained blankets outside and beat them until her arms ached. She was not just cleaning. She was reclaiming. When the sun began to dip, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange, they stopped. The yard was clear of debris. The house was swept. It was still a ruin, but it was a clean ruin. They sat on the back step, the one that was not damaged, and shared a piece of jerky. Jack looked at his hands. They were blistered, black with soot. Gus and Billy will be back tomorrow, he said. Sarah nodded. They will be hungry. Jack almost laughed. It was a rough, rusty sound. Yes, they will. He looked at her. Her face was smudged with dirt. Her hair was tied back with a piece of string. Your room, he said, stumbling over the words. The door is broken. She looked at him, her gaze level. Yes. You can take my room. I will sleep in the main room, by the fire. She was quiet for a long time. "I am not afraid of you, Jack Donovan," she said. "I know," he replied. It is just proper." She gave him a look, one that held a flicker of the old, dry wit he was just beginning to see. "Proper," she said. "After last night." He had no answer to that. "I will stay in my room," she said. "A broken door does not matter. There is nothing left to lock out." That night, he laid his bedroll by the hearth. The main room was vast and cold, with the wind whistling through the empty window frames. He lay awake, his rifle beside him, listening. He heard her move into her room. He heard the cot creak. He did not hear the sound of a key in a lock. He slept. It was the first deep, dreamless sleep he had had in a year. Gus and Billy returned late the next afternoon. They looked bone-weary. They rode into a yard that was already being reborn. Jack was on the roof, hammering new shingles. Sarah was on the ground, measuring a new piece of pine for a window frame. Gus pulled the wagon to a halt. He just sat, staring. "Boss," he called out, his voice hoarse. Jack paused, hammer in hand. He looked down. "Gus, you are back." "Aye." He climbed down slowly. Billy followed, his movements stiff. "The sheriff," Gus said, walking over, his eyes on Sarah. He took his hat off. "Afternoon, Miss Sarah." Sarah nodded to him, her hand still. "The sheriff sends his thanks," Gus continued. "Said you saved the county a lot of trouble. Thorn, his ranch is falling apart. The men he hired are scattered. No one is coming back. It is over." Jack felt a wave of relief so strong it made him dizzy. He sat down on the roof. "Over." Gus looked at the work they had done. "You too. You have been busy." Jack nodded. "We have." Billy, who had been silent, spoke up, his voice still holding a trace of awe. "Miss Sarah, that shot you made, with the bow, I have never seen anything like it." Sarah looked at the boy. She saw his respect. She gave him a small, tight nod. It was enough. That night, they ate dinner at the main table, the four of them. Sarah did not serve them and retreat. She brought the pot of stew to the table, set it in the middle, and sat down. She sat in the new plain chair Jack had brought in from the shed. Gus and Billy looked at each other, but they were hungry, and the stew smelled better than anything in memory. Gus ladled it out. They ate. The silence was companionable. Gus broke it. He looked at Jack. "So, the barn is gone." Jack nodded. "We will build a new one." Where Gus asked, Jack pointed. "Same spot. It is a good spot." Sarah spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "No." 3 heads turned to her. Jack looked at her, surprised. "It is too close," she said. "It blocks the view." If they had hidden behind it, she did not need to finish. She pointed to a flat, open patch of ground, 100 yards west of the house. "Build it there. You can see all around. And the wind. It will take the smell away from the house." Jack, Gus, and Billy looked at the spot. They considered it. She was right. It was a better place. Smarter, more defensible. Jack looked at Gus. Gus looked at Jack. Gus shrugged. "Makes sense to me, boss." Jack turned to Sarah. He smiled, a real warm smile that lit his gray eyes. "All right," he said. "We build it there." And just like that, the Tilted J was no longer just his ranch. It was theirs. The rebuilding took the rest of the winter. They worked from sunup to sundown. They were a team. Jack and Gus, with their knowledge of carpentry, led the building of the new barn. Billy, quick and strong, did the heavy hauling, and Sarah was everywhere. She was strong as Billy. Hauling logs, she was smart, seeing problems before they happened. She was also, Jack learned, an incredible planner. She organized the supplies. She managed the food. She found a way to mend their torn clothes, her stitches small and perfect. She was the heart that kept the operation running. But her true project was the garden. The day Jack brought the seeds from Junction, she held the small paper bags in her hands like they were gold. She knelt in the patch of earth she had cleared, the patch that had once been Mary, her garden. Jack watched her from the porch. She did not just plant, it was a ritual. She drew lines in the earth. She built small mounds. She planted the corn first. Then, around the corn, she planted the beans, and finally, between the mounds, she planted the squash, the three sisters. She was putting down roots. As the weather warmed, their own relationship, tentative and fragile, began to grow, as slow and steady as the garden. They were not lovers, not in the physical sense. The ranch was small, and Gus and Billy were always there. Their intimacy was one of shared purpose, not of stolen touches. But it was there. It was in the way he brought her coffee in the morning, just the way she liked it, black and strong. It was in the way she mended his coat, the patch on the elbow so neat it was almost invisible. It was in the long, quiet evening. Gus and Billy would go to their bunkhouse, which they had repaired first. Jack and Sarah would be left in the main room. The house was secure now. It had new windows, a new, heavy door, and a porch built of thick, solid pine. Jack would sit by the fire, reading an old newspaper. Sarah would sit in her chair, sometimes mending, sometimes oiling the rifle with a practiced hand. Sometimes she would just sit, watching the flames. One night, he looked up from his paper. She was watching him. What he asked. "You are a good man," she said. "You kept your word." He put the paper down. "And you are a remarkable woman." She looked away, a faint flush on her high cheekbones. He had never complimented her. She did not know what to do with it. "The 5 months are long over," he said quietly. She nodded. "I know. You never asked for your wages." "I do not need them," she said. "I have," she looked around the room, "everything I need." Jack, his heart felt too big for his chest. He stood up. He walked over to her. He knelt in front of her chair. She looked down at him, her eyes wide, a little fearful. He did not kiss her. He just took her hand. It was not the raw, calloused hand he had first seen. It was still strong, but it was cared for. "I love you, Sarah Redfeather," he said. It was not a question. It was a statement. She looked at their joined hands. I do not know." "I know," he said, cutting her off gently. "You do not have to say it. You do not have to do anything. I wanted you to know." He stood up and went to his room, leaving her alone by the fire. He was giving her space. He was giving her freedom. She sat there for a long time. She looked at the fire. She looked at his empty chair. She thought of the fire that had taken her family. She had been cold for so long. She had been alone. She was not alone anymore. She stood up and walked down the hall. She stopped at his door. It was slightly open. She could see him, standing by the window, looking out at the moonlit yard. She pushed the door open. He turned. His face was full of hope and fear. She walked to him. She did not speak. She reached up and put her hand on his cheek, just as he had done on the ridge. He closed his eyes, his voice a broken whisper. "Sarah, I am not afraid," she said. "Not anymore." And in the quiet of the rebuilt ranch house, surrounded by the high, lonely plains, she kissed him. It was not the desperate, smoky kiss of the battle. It was a kiss of promise. It was slow, and it was deep. It was the kiss of a woman who had finally, after a lifetime of running, found her way home. The snows melted. The high plains wind lost its winter bite and began to carry the scent of damp earth and new pine. The creek, which had been a frozen ribbon, swelled into a rushing, noisy torrent, brown with mountain runoff. Spring had come to the Tilted J. With the spring came a new life, one that was quiet, steady, and strong. The ranch, scarred but standing, began to heal, and so did its people. The new barn, built on the spot Sarah had chosen, was a testament to their shared work. It was a better barn, stronger, built of thick pine logs, its roofline clean against the vast blue sky. The house, too, was whole again. Jack had built a new porch, wider and sturdier than the one before. The windows were all glazed, the front door solid oak. Inside, the house was no longer a hollow, male shell. It was a home. Sarah had, little by little, transformed it. It was still simple, still sparse, but it was warm. She had woven new rugs from scraps of cloth, bright patches of color on the scrubbed wooden floors. The kitchen was truly hers, the shelves full, the air always holding the faint, good smell of baking bread or simmering stew. Mary, her small rocking chair, still sat by the hearth. Jack had, one day, taken the old calico quilt, folded it gently, and put it in his trunk. The next day, he found Sarah sitting in the chair, not rocking, just mending one of his shirts, the late afternoon sun falling across her hands. He had watched her for a long minute, his heart full. The past was not erased, but it had made room for the present. Their life together found its own rhythm. It was a life of shared labor. Jack was no longer just the boss, and she was no longer just the cook. They were partners. He taught her about the cattle, about branding, about the hard, complex business of running the ranch. He found she had a mind for it, a sharp, practical sense that saw problems long before he did. She rode with him, not behind him, but beside him. She was a natural in the saddle, as if born to it, and she carried her rifle as easily as he carried his. In return, she taught him about the land, not his land, the land defined by fences and deeds, but the land, the living earth. She showed him the herbs that could cure a cough, the roots that could be roasted, the quiet signs of the deer, the meaning of a hawk, his cry. He, who had lived there for a dozen years, learned that he had been blind. She taught him to see. Her room, the one with the broken door, was now a storeroom. Her things, few as they were in his room. She had not moved in all at once. It had happened slowly. One night, after a long day rebuilding a section of fence, he had come in, bone-weary. She had been in his room, not hers. She had simply turned down the blankets on his bed, her bed, their bed. It was a silent, simple invitation that spoke more than 1,000 words. Their nights were as quiet and as deep as their days. It was a love born not of youthful passion, but of profound, tested respect. It was the comfort of two people who had stood back to back in a fight and had come out the other side. Gus and Billy had settled into the new reality with an easy, grateful acceptance. They adored Sarah. They called her Miss Sarah, and their respect was absolute. The food was good, the house was warm, and the ranch was safer than it had ever been. They were a family, forged in fire and smoke, and they all knew it. Billy, who had been a boy, was now a man. His admiration for Sarah a quiet, steady thing. Gus, his cough easing in the warm weather, just watched, his old eyes crinkless _unit_ with _smile. He had seen his boss, his friend, hollowed out by grief. Now he saw him whole, and he was happy. One day in late May, Jack pulled the buckboard wagon to the front of the house. The garden Sarah had planted was thriving. The first green shoots of the three sisters, the corn, beans, and squash, were pushing up through the dark earth. Sarah came out of the house. She was not wearing trousers. She was wearing a simple dress, the one made from the tough, brown duck cloth he had bought her. She had sewn it herself, and it fit her perfectly, practical and strong, just like her. Her hair was in its single, thick braid. "Where are we going?" she asked. "To town," he said, holding out a hand to help her up. "We need salt and flour and—" He paused. "You still need those seeds, the ones I promised." She looked at his outstretched hand. She did not need it. She was strong enough to climb up herself, but she took it. She placed her hand in his, and he felt the familiar, strong grip. He helped her up to the seat. The ride to Junction was long, but it was not the silent, tense journey of their first trip. They talked. They spoke of the cattle, of the need for rain, of Gus, his cough. They rode together, their shoulders brushing. When they passed the spot where the land crumpled toward the mountains, she pointed. "That is where I find the sage," she said. "It is good for the stew." He nodded, filing the information away. When they reached Junction, the town seemed smaller. The 3 dusty streets were the same. The false-fronted buildings were still there, but they were different. Jack pulled the wagon to a stop in front of Abernathy, his general store. He tied the reins. He stepped down. Then he turned and held up his arms for Sarah. She placed her hands on his shoulders, and he lifted her down, his hands spanning her waist. He set her on the boardwalk as gently as if she were made of glass. Heads turned. Mrs. Abernathy, who was sweeping the same patch of boardwalk, froze, her mouth a small O. The blacksmith stopped hammering. A few ranchers, lounging outside the Silver Dollar Saloon, fell silent. They were not seeing the wild, half-starved girl in a torn saloon dress. They were seeing a woman, poised and beautiful, her head held high, standing beside Jack Donovan, the owner of the Tilted J. She was not his servant. She was his woman. It was plain to see. Jack felt their stares. He did not care. He felt a fierce, burning pride. He put his hand on the small of her back. "Let us go," he said. They walked into the store. "Mr. Abernathy was behind the counter, his green visor in place. His eyes widened when he saw them. He looked from Jack to Sarah, and his expression, once so disapproving, was now one of cautious respect. A man like Thorne was dead. A man like Donovan, who had survived, was to be respected. And the woman who had stood with him, she was to be feared. "Good day, Mr. Donovan." "Ma'am," Abernathy stammered. "Good day, Silas," Jack said, his voice easy. He had not called him Silas in 10 years. "We need flour, salt, coffee." As Jack gave the order, Sarah walked through the store. She was not hesitant. She was not afraid. She moved with purpose. She picked out a new, sharp axe head. She found a heavy wool blanket, a deep, rich red. She found a small tin of lemon drops, and this time, she put them in the basket herself. Then she found the seeds. She gathered them, her movements sure: corn, beans, squash, and more. Turnips, carrots, herbs. She brought them to the counter. Jack was already paying, counting out the coins. Abernathy looked at the pile of seeds, then at Sarah. You have a garden up there?" he asked, his curiosity overcoming his caution. Sarah met his gaze. Her eyes were not cold, not fiery. They were just calm. "We do," she said. "It is growing." Jack paid for the supplies. He and Sarah carried them out to the wagon. He felt light. He felt happy. He had not just come to town for supplies. He had come to show them, to show her. This was her home. This was her place. As he was loading the last sack, a man stepped out of the Silver Dollar. It was Silas, the saloon owner, his vest straining as always. He had watched them. He waddled over, his face a mixture of fear and oily respect. "Mr. Donovan," he said, nodding. "Ma'am." He looked at Sarah. I see you are doing well. That was a bad business with Thorne." Jack just looked at him, his face hard. Silas wiped his sweaty palms on his apron. I am glad it worked out for you. Mr. Donovan, you found a good cook after all." Jack's hand tightened on the wagon rail. He was about to say something cold and sharp. But Sarah spoke first. Her voice was quiet, but it carried in the street. "He did not find a cook. Mr. Silas," she said, "he found a wife." "Silas." His jaw dropped. "Jack." His head snapped around. He stared at her. She had not spoken of this. They had not discussed. She looked at Jack, a small, bright challenge in her eyes. A smile played at the corners of her mouth. Jack felt a grin split his face, a wide, rusty, joyful grin he had not felt since he was a boy. He looked at Silas, his gray eyes shining.
"That is right," he said, his voice booming. "I did."
He put his hand on Sarah, his arm, and helped her onto the wagon seat. He climbed up beside her. He took the reins. He did not look back at the shocked faces of the town. He clicked his tongue, and the wagon moved, rolling out of Junction, heading home. They rode in silence for a time, the plains opening up around them. "Wife," Jack said, his voice quiet. Sarah looked at her hands, which were folded in her lap. Is it not true?" Jack stopped the wagon. He just stopped, in the middle of the vast, empty land. He turned to her. He took her face in his hands, his rough, calloused thumbs tracing the high line of her cheekbones. "Yes," he said, his voice thick with an emotion so powerful it almost choked him. "It is true." He kissed her. He kissed her there, under the high, open sky, with the wind singing around them. It was not a kiss of passion or of desperation. It was a kiss of pure, quiet joy. It was the kiss of a man who had been given a second life. When they reached the ranch, the sun was setting. The sky was on fire, a blaze of orange and red and purple. Gus and Billy were finishing the evening chores. The smoke from the chimney, where Sarah had left a stew to simmer, rose in a thin, straight line. Jack and Sarah did not go inside. They stood by the fence, by her garden. The new plants were green and strong in the twilight. They looked out at the land, their land. It was still harsh. It was still unforgiving. The winters would be hard. There would be droughts. There would be challenges. But they were not afraid. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him. She was not a captive. She was not a servant. She was a partner. She was a warrior. She was his wife. She was home. He had come west looking for room, for a place to be free. He had looked for a cook to ease his loneliness, and in the middle of the empty, wild land, in the most unlikely woman in the world, he had found everything. He had found his peace. He had found his strength. He had found his love. They stood together, watching the last of the sun disappear behind the dark, sleeping mountains, ready for the future they would build, side by side. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love to hear where you are tuning in from, so please drop a comment below so we can all connect. And do not forget to subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales. Like this video, and give us a boost by pressing the hype button so more people can share in this tale.